As we begin today's hearing, I invite you to support the channel. Please subscribe, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from.
In my years on the bench, I learned something simple. When a person walks into a courtroom with their eyes down, they're usually not hiding disrespect, they're hiding pain. That morning was quiet in the way municipal court mornings often are. A small room, a handful of older folks holding folded notices like they were fragile, two young drivers in baseball caps trying not to look worried. The sound was mostly paper pages turning, a pen tapping once and stopping, a cough swallowed into a sleeve. I was moving through the calendar the way you do after decades, steady, efficient, ready to listen, but not expecting anything to pull me off routine. Then I watched him come in. He was around 55, maybe 60. His clothes were worn, but clean. Someone still cared enough to keep them that way, even if the fabric had given up. A backpack sat close to his feet like it was the only thing in the world he could claim, without question. He walked slowly, with a slight limp, and he didn't sit right away. He waited for my gesture, the way people do when they've been trained to follow order. His hands were folded in front of him, not in prayer, more like restraint. His shoulders curved forward just a little, as if he'd learned to take up less space. His eyes stayed on the floor, not because he was ashamed of me or the court, because he didn't want to be seen. I've seen arrogance stroll in with a smile. This wasn't that. This was a man trying to disappear while still doing what he was told. On paper, the matter was small. A missed payment on a fine tied to a minor public order violation, sleeping where he wasn't allowed to sleep. Nothing serious, no violence, no shouting, just the kind of entry that gets processed and pushed along. But something didn't sit right with me. When I asked his name, he didn't mumble, he didn't hesitate. He gave me his full name clearly, evenly, like it was an old habit from a life where details mattered and mistakes had consequences. In my mind, I thought people introduced themselves like that when they once carried responsibility bigger than their own troubles. I asked him to explain what happened. His voice stayed steady, but his hands didn't. A slight tremble, small, controlled, almost embarrassed by its own presence. That wasn't fear of court. That was fear of being misunderstood. I opened the report, and right then I knew this case hadn't landed on my list by accident. I looked down at the report and saw what the system wanted me to see. A simple violation, presence in a public place after hours. An officer asked him to move along. He complied. No resistance, no attitude. Still, the citation was written, the fine assessed, the clock started ticking the way it always does. On paper, it was clean, efficient, almost sterile. But the law doesn't live on paper. It lives where people do. The report didn't ask where he went after he was told to leave. It didn't ask where he was supposed to go. It didn't note that the benches nearby were wet from the night before, or that the shelter down the street had been full before sunset. The form didn't have a box for that. It never does. I've learned over the years that the system is very good at recording what happened. It's far less curious about why. As I read further, a pattern began to show itself. A few similar encounters, always the same ending. He left when told. He showed up to court when summoned. He never argued. He never paid on time, not because he refused, but because the money simply wasn't there. That kind of record tells its own story if you're willing to slow down long enough to read between the lines. I asked him why he hadn't asked for help. The question wasn't accusatory, it was practical. He looked up just enough to answer, then back down again. I didn't think it was my place, he said. No anger, no bitterness, just a quiet finality, like he'd said those words before to himself, many times. In that moment, I understood something important. This wasn't a man playing the victim. Victims explain too much. This was a man who'd learned to expect very little. As I scanned the page again, one line caught my attention. It was short, almost an afterthought. Subject identified himself as veteran, no branch listed, no years, No context, just a label, typed and left alone. I felt my posture change slightly. My father used to tell me that you have to listen to people twice, once when they speak and once when they don't. That line was silence on paper, and it was loud. I looked back at him, still standing the way he had when he entered. Hands folded, eyes lowered, waiting to be told what came next. That's when I knew this case wasn't about a mispayment or a closed park. So I closed the file just enough to remind myself of something I'd learned long ago. Sometimes justice begins the moment you step beyond the questions you're given and start asking the ones that matter. I asked him where he served. It wasn't a dramatic question. No edge to it, no performance behind it. Just a simple sentence, spoken the same way I'd asked it 100 times before. But the moment it reached him, I saw the shift. His shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Like a reflex, he didn't bother hiding. His hands, which had finally gone still, drew a little closer together, and then he stopped. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched longer than most people expect in a courtroom. Not awkward heavy, the kind of pause that makes people glance up, even when they're trying not to listen. He took a deep breath, slow and deliberate, the kind that starts in the chest before it ever reaches the lungs. For the first time since he had walked through my door, his eyes lifted. Not fully, just enough to look past the edge of the bench instead of into the floor. In all my years on the bench, I've learned something simple. People don't go quiet like that, unless the truth is standing right in front of them. Army, he said. One word. Clean. Controlled. No tremor. No extra explanation. The way someone answers when they've said it before to doctors, to officials, to themselves. I nodded and waited. I didn't fill the space. Silence, when used with care, isn't pressure. It's permission. After a moment, he continued without being prompted. Dates, locations, units. His memory was sharp, almost exact. No searching for words, no drifting. This wasn't a story he was piecing together. It was something he carried intact, like muscle memory. I glanced down at the report again. None of that was there. Just a single line, typed and abandoned. Subject identified himself as veteran. No years of service, no deployment, no return. Around us, the room changed. People stopped shifting in their seats. A man in the back leaned forward slightly. Someone folded their papers and forgot about them. Even those who had come in worried only about their own tickets felt it now. Truth has a way of narrowing a space until everyone is standing closer than they expected. Then I asked him what happened after he came home. This time, the pause was different. His mouth opened, then closed again. He swallowed. His gaze dropped back to the floor, not in shame, but in calculation, like he was deciding how much of himself this room was allowed to see. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't break. It slowed. That's not in the report, he said. He wasn't deflecting. He wasn't being clever. He was stating a fact, plain and undeniable, and he was right. I felt something settle in me then. Not frustration, understanding. This man wasn't withholding excuses. He wasn't trying to manipulate sympathy. He was protecting a story, one that had cost him something, and one he wasn't sure the system deserved to hear. I thought of my father, and something he used to say, without realizing he was teaching a lesson. Dignity isn't about telling everything. It's about knowing what parts of yourself you give away, and to whom. I closed the folder in front of me. Not sharply, not with finality, just enough to signal that the paper had reached the end of its authority. I looked at him and said we were going to pause for a moment. He nodded once, almost automatically. The room stayed silent, waiting, and that's when he did something no document, no protocol, no citation could have prepared me for. I gave the room a moment to breathe. I didn't speak. I didn't look down at the file. I watched him instead. That's when he did something I hadn't expected. Slowly, almost carefully, he reached up and began to unfasten his jacket. Not in a rush, not as a display. The movement carried hesitation, like he was asking himself whether he had the right to do what he was about to do. His hands trembled, not wildly, not out of control, but enough to tell the truth of the effort it took. Each motion was precise, deliberate, the way hands move when they've been trained to stay steady under pressure. His breathing deepened, heavier than the moment required. I remember thinking, people don't make gestures like that when they're trying to win a case. They do it when they're trying to tell the truth. He stopped halfway, jacket loosened, and stood there. He didn't speak. The courtroom grew so quiet I could hear the soft, mechanical hum of the air conditioning above us. No one shifted. No one coughed. Even the papers seemed to wait. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't ask what he was doing. This was one of those moments a judge earns his robe not by speaking, but by knowing when not to. After a long pause, he looked up again, not at me this time, but somewhere just past the bench, as if the memory needed space. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost careful, like he was afraid the words might break if he handled them roughly. "I didn't come back the same," he said. "That was all. No details, no explanation, no appeal, just a fact that hadn't appeared in any report, any citation, any record that passed across my desk. It wasn't a confession of wrongdoing. It was an admission of loss." The effect on the room was immediate and unmistakable. A woman in the front row lowered her eyes. Someone a few seats back swallowed hard. I saw a man press his lips together, as if holding something in. The case had stopped being something people were watching. It had become something they were hearing. I felt the shift myself. The legal issue hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something heavier, something the law doesn't always know how to carry. This was the moment where the clean lines of a statute meet the uneven edges of a life. I thought of all the times I'd seen men raise their voices to protect themselves. This wasn't that. This was a man who had run out of distance to hide behind. In that silence, I understood what he was risking, not judgment, but exposure. And I knew my responsibility in that moment wasn't to bend the law until it broke, or to harden it until it cut. It was to hold it steady, because this was the point where law meets life show up face to face, and neither of them is allowed to look away. I let his words sit where they landed, not because I wanted drama, because I wanted accuracy. In my courtroom, emotion can be present, but it can't be in charge. I opened the folder again, but this time I wasn't reading it like a checklist. I was looking for a bridge between what the paper said and what the man in front of me had finally allowed us to see. "I'm going to ask you a few questions," I told him. "Not to cross-examine you, just to understand you." He nodded once. I asked where he'd been staying. He answered plainly, "Different corners of the city, wherever the night didn't push too hard." I asked if he'd ever refused to leave when an officer told him to move. "No, sir," he said. No attitude, no self-pity, just a simple fact. Then I asked about the fine, why it wasn't paid. He didn't say the system was unfair. He didn't blame anyone. He said, I had to choose. And he didn't list the choices because he didn't need to. People who've lived that kind of life don't decorate it with explanations. They just describe it the way a man describes weather. His answers were steady, almost disciplined. He gave dates the way someone gives coordinates. He corrected himself once, not to protect an image, but because he wanted the truth clean. That told me something important. This wasn't a man slipping through rules because he didn't respect. This was a man being crushed by rules that never paused long enough to see him. I felt that familiar weight in my chest, the one I've carried since I was a young lawyer, watching how quickly the world can label a person and move on. Some people break rules because they think they're above them. And some people break rules because the rules were written for lives they no longer have. I looked at him and said, do you have anyone helping you right now? Any veteran services? Any outreach program? He hesitated just a fraction. No, he said. And then, after a beat, I didn't want to be a burden. That sentence was the most revealing thing he'd said all morning. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Pride doesn't always look like arrogance. Sometimes it looks like a man freezing in place while his life slides away, because asking for help feels like failing. From the gallery, a woman's voice rose softly. She wasn't speaking to me. She wasn't trying to influence the court. She spoke the way people speak when they forget they're in public. "You're not a burden," she said. "My brother served. Please let someone help you." No applause, no murmurs, just the quiet after a truth that doesn't need permission. I watched him absorb it. His eyes stayed down, but his jaw tightened, like he was fighting the urge to react. That's a kind of courage, too, the courage to stay standing when kindness arrives unexpectedly. I turned back to the case. The violation was real. The officer had done his job. The city has rules about closed public spaces for reasons that are not cruel. I wasn't going to pretend none of that mattered. But I also wasn't going to punish a man for surviving. So I spoke plainly, the way my father taught me to speak when something mattered. Direct, respectful, and without ornament. "Here's what I'm going to do," I said. "I'm not dismissing the fact that there was a violation, but I'm also not going to impose a penalty that ignores your reality." I ordered the matter closed on a condition within the bounds of what I could do. He would report to a Veterans Assistance Program and provide confirmation of his first appointment. No grand declarations, no savior talk, just a legal outcome tied to a real path forward. He blinked once, slow, like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Then he nodded, not grateful yet, not relieved, just stunned into stillness. And right there, with the courtroom holding its breath, I saw something change in him that no report could record. His shoulders rose a little, as if a weight had shifted only slightly, but enough to notice. That was the moment the decision became real. He stood there for a moment after I finished. No rush, no visible relief, just stillness, like someone learning how to hold a different kind of weight. Then he nodded. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, but his shoulders, which had been pulled forward all morning, eased just a little. Not pride, not victory, something quieter, permission to stand straighter. "Thank you for listening," he said. "Not for the decision, not for the outcome, for listening." He turned and walked out slowly, the same limp as before, but the movement felt different now, less guarded, like a man who knew where he was going next, even if the path was still uncertain. The room didn't erupt. Nobody clapped. People didn't immediately gather their things. They stayed seated a moment longer than usual, as if leaving too quickly would break something fragile. Then, one by one, they returned to their own lives, a little quieter than when they'd come in. I called the next case. The day moved on. It always does. Months later, a brief notice crossed my desk. Nothing formal, just confirmation that he had reported to the Veterans Program. First meeting attended, temporary housing arranged, no further citations, no new entries under his name. A small result, but a real one. I've presided over thousands of cases. Most of them blur together over time, dates, fines, names that fade into paperwork, but every so often one stays with you. Not because of what you did, but because of what you were allowed to witness. I thought again of my father. He used to say that listening isn't passive, that it's a responsibility, that when someone trusts you with their silence, you have to be careful what you do next. That man didn't ask the court to save him. He didn't demand mercy. He just stopped hiding long enough to be seen. And sometimes that's all justice needs to begin. Not every silence is empty, and not every truth needs to be shouted. Sometimes justice starts the moment we choose to listen.